Hello and welcome to the third installment of the Smart Grid Made Simple series, maximizing the benefits of smart grid investments by regulated utilities. Up to now in this series, the content that I've covered applies fairly universally to both to any kind of utility. And for part 3, we're going to talk specifically about investor-owned utilities. 75% of Americans are covered by investor-owned utilities, and as well as we'll talk about the regulators who regulate them in their monopoly state. We'll talk about the top regulatory issues that inhibit smart grid benefits, and I don't mean to disparage regulators or utilities at all. Their jobs are difficult. They all want to do a good job, but you know, there's a lot of things for them to focus on, and my hope is that through this series they can prioritize some of the right things to focus on to maximize the value of the smart grid. I'd like to start off with a little bit of a introduction to the Smart Grid Made Simple series and the Wired Group. The Smart Grid Made Simple series is a set of 3 webcasts that are pre-recorded and aimed at the layperson to help them better understand the smart grid and how it works and how to maximize the benefit of it. Part 1 was kind of an introduction and covered the benefits, costs, and risks of smart grid deployments as my teams have identified in evaluations of large utility deployments in Colorado and in Ohio. Part 2, we talked about the fact that smart grid investments are different and that utilities must manage them differently. We talked about how utilities, members of governing boards, and even customers can maximize the value of smart grid investments, pretty much applying again to all types of utilities. But now part 3, we're going to look specifically at investor-owned utilities and the regulators. The Wire Group, what we do is help clients unleash the latent value in distribution utility businesses. There's a list of the folks we do it for, the specialties we participate in besides the smart grid, including renewable energy, demand side management, and customer service enhancement. And as far as the consulting engagement life cycle, we participate in all components from strategy and planning to implementation, performance measurement, and performance improvement. In part 3, we're going to start by reviewing some of the key points from part 2. And if you haven't reviewed part 2, I'd encourage you to do so. It's pretty helpful, I think, in understanding part 3. We're going to do some education here in part 3, as we've done in part 1 and part 2. But 2 primary focus areas. One is why utility incentives to invest need to be tweaked. We're going to have an educational slide, description of the issue associated with a smart grid, and then a potential solution to that issue. Similarly, we'll go through the same process for utility incentives to increase electric sales volumes. Again, a little bit of education about why that exists, what the issues are related to the smart grid, and then examine some potential solutions, and that will round out our series. If you'll remember from part 2, some of our key points, the primary one being that smart grid investments are different than almost any other investment utilities can make. It's not just putting money into the grid, it's also maximizing the value of the new capabilities that you get from those investments. Formal change management critical to using those capabilities wisely throughout the organization, the utility organization. And then finally, what customers can do to maximize smart grid value, including participating in time of use rate programs and demand response programs. You can save money that way. Voicing opposition to unsupported anti-smart meter claims. There's a pretty vocal minority out there, but the reality is that the benefits are pretty substantial and the risks are pretty low when it comes to smart meters and smart grids. So don't hesitate to voice opposition to those claims if they're unsupported. And then finally, encourage your utility to report smart grid benefits annually, in economic benefits and reliability benefits and customer service benefits. To the extent you can do that, they will certainly, I would think, endeavor to improve on those metrics. So first, 3 slides today on why incentives to invest need to be tweaked. We'll start with a little bit of education on why regulated investor-owned utilities get incentives to invest. It is a good idea. We'll talk about the particular issues that compensation method raises when it comes to the smart grid, and then talk about a potential solution in performance-based cost recovery. So as far as the educational component goes, incenting investor-owned utilities to invest in their grid infrastructure is a good idea. Grids take a lot of money to build and maintain and improve, and therefore the grid owners, in this case investor-owned distribution utilities, have to raise a lot of capital to build, maintain, and improve their grids. They do that through shareholders by making private equity public stock offerings, and through banks by obtaining loans. And as you know, as likely a mortgage holder, you need to make money to get loans. No one's going to give you a loan if you're not making any money, and so a fair rate of return is necessary if these investor-owned distribution utilities are to attract capital, which they can therefore invest. And it does make economic sense to have one grid per geography. I know people are anti-monopoly, but when it comes to distribution, it makes no sense to have 2 or 3 sets of utility lines going down the street. It's best when it comes to distribution to have just one single set of distribution lines. Now, in exchange for that monopoly operation, the investor-owned utilities agreed to submit to regulators' authority, and all states have a public utilities commission of some sort to serve that function. And these utilities also agree to limit their shareholder profits to what's called a rate of return on equity. So if I put in $1 worth of capital, I can make 8% or 9% return on that investment as a shareholder. So this is an important compensation structure that works well, but as you may remember from part 2, the smart grid investments are different, in that making the investment in the grid is only part of the story. The next question is, well, what am I doing to maximize the new capabilities? And so if there are only incentives to invest and no incentives for performance, then chances are the performance is not going to be as strong as it otherwise might be. So in addition to investment incentives, I'm suggesting some performance-based incentives that would reduce shareholder returns if the value creation is not as high as one might expect, and increase shareholder returns if value creation is higher than one might expect. Of course, the challenge is in the details. What's the right size of those risk and reward? How do you measure value creation? Those are valid points which we'll take care of, I would imagine, in some future Smart Grid Made Simple series webcast. So regarding the details of performance-based cost recovery, I must say that there's probably too much to go into in the scope of this webcast, but suffice it to say that in some states the utilities bear all the risk of getting value out of smart grid investments, and the regulators can deny cost recovery. Like in Maryland, the utilities might not get any money back, and so in that case you're actually discouraging utility investment because they're going to say, that's too risky for us. At the other extreme, in some states like Illinois and Texas, you've got customers bearing most of the risk, where the utilities are going to get pretty close to their rate of return, regardless of how well they utilize these new smart grid capabilities. And what you need to do is balance the risk somewhere in the middle, as has been done in Ohio and Oklahoma, in which case the regulators have said, yeah, go ahead, put the stuff in. We'll let you collect it from customers through a rider, but we're going to put some limits on you. And if you perform well, we'll give you a little extra money. And if you perform poorly, we're going to take some money away. And that's probably about the right place to be. The next area of focus in part 3 is about incentives to increase electric sales volumes that utilities have, investor-owned utilities have. We're going to, similarly to the last issue, we're going to do an educational session, talk about what the issue is, in particular with smart grid investments, and then cover some potential solutions. So for the educational components of this, I'd like to talk about the characteristics of distribution costs and cost recovery. The first point is that electric distribution costs are largely fixed, regardless of whether you have 500 million kilowatt hours sold in a year or 1 billion kilowatt hours sold in a year. You still have to have a distribution network connected to all the homes and businesses that facilitate the distribution of that electricity. There's not a lot of variable costs associated with electric distribution. At the same time, utility cost recovery in most cases, in most states, is based on sales volume. So they charge you by kilowatt hour. So typically the way this works is a utility will tell a regulator, hey, I had $70 million in costs I need to recover every year. The regulator says, well, how many kilowatt hours are you going to sell next year? And the utility says, well, I'm going to sell 1.4 billion kilowatt hours next year, I think. And so the regulator says, okay, great. If you divide that out, that comes to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Go ahead and charge that. And in fact, if the utility sells exactly 1.4 billion kilowatt hours annually at 5 cents, they will get their $70 million, which includes, a profit component. But the problem is, what happens when the utility sells more or less than that? What happens in those cases is that utilities win when sales volumes go up between rate cases, and they lose when sales volumes go down, and so they have a kind of a built-in disinterest in reducing sales volumes. The rose-colored area here represent a utility's revenues. The blue areas represent a utility's costs, and you can see when electricity volumes go up between rate cases, the utility does well, but when volumes go down, the utility does poorly and does not get their full rate of return. So in the smart grid, this poses a challenge because some of the top smart grid benefits are related to reducing sales volumes. So for example, time of use rates have been proven in many cases to reduce sales volumes. Prepaid metering can reduce sales volumes, and integrated volt-var control can reduce sales volumes. And if you want to brush up on those, you can review part 1 of this series. But this is a big issue in all but 17 states that have passed something called decoupling to alleviate this issue. Some potential solutions, as I mentioned, decoupling. This is the list of states that have implemented decoupling, and without going into too much detail, it simply removes a utility's incentive to sell more energy, and also removes the disincentive to sell less. So that's one potential solution. Another potential solution is to allow smart grid capabilities to qualify for energy efficiency program credits. So if you have a demand-side management program in your state that kind of encourages utilities to do energy efficiency, you already know that they're provided some kind of way to make up for their lost sales and some kind of incentive for doing a good job there. And certainly certain smart grid investments could fall into that category, and would be another potential solution to eliminate the disincentive for some smart grid investments and some smart grid capabilities. So with that, I'd like to wrap up the first 3 installments of our Smart Grid Made Simple series. If you have a question about the smart grid you think we should address in a future webcast, please let me know. If you know someone in the industry, certainly provide them with the links to this information and let them take a look. Perhaps we could be of some assistance or value to them. I hope this series was of value to you, and I encourage you to take the steps featured in these webcasts to maximize the value of smart grid investments in your communities. Thank you.